Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Hala Auji, the Hamad bin Khalifa Chair of Islamic Art and Associate Professor of Art History with the VCU School of the Arts, Richmond campus. I am delighted to welcome you to the final lecture of this year's faculty lecture series, presented by my VCU Arts colleague, Dr. Holiday Powers. Dr. Powers is an assistant professor of global modern contemporary art, emphasizing art in the Arab world. She received her PhD in 2015 from Cornell University, and her first book, Moroccan Modernism, is forthcoming in the new African History series at the Ohio University Press. Her research emphasizes the articulation of local and transnational discourses in modern and contemporary art, particularly within the Arab world, from the post-colonial and feminist theory perspective. Her new research focuses on representations of maternal bodies in global modern and contemporary art. She's contributed to numerous publications, including NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, and the Journal of North African Studies. Additionally, she has been active in contemporary art, including her role as an artistic program coordinator and parallel projects for the Marrakesh Biennial 5. Powers has also curated 2 exhibitions for the VCU Arts Qatar Gallery in Doha. There will be time for questions following the lecture, so please make sure that you familiarize yourself with with Zoom's Q&A option or the chat functions. And of course, a question might come up during the lecture. So feel free to use those 2 options during the lecture, and I will collect those questions and ask them during our Q&A. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Holiday Powers.
Thank you so much, Hala, for your introduction and for joining me. Thank you also to VCU for having me in this series, to Kelly for your organization, to Vanna and Peyton for being here to help with the tech. So I will share my PowerPoint. This paper is titled Moroccan Modernism, 1956 to 1978. In Morocco in 1969, a group of artists from Casablanca exhibited their artwork in a large public plaza in the southern city, Marrakesh. The artworks were installed outdoors on the stone walls of Jemaa el-Fna, a storied square known for its public spectacles and night markets, as well as its place at the end of Saharan trade routes. Titled Présence Plastique, or Plastic Presence, and acting in their words as a manifesto, this exhibition is an iconic moment in the art history of Morocco, with the leading modernist abstract painters of the country eschewing an official salon in the city that had been organized by the Ministry of Culture. Instead, the Casablanca artists, who you see here in this photograph, Farid Belkahia, Mohamed Malehi, Mohamed Shaba, Mohamed Homa Atala, Mohamed Hamidi, and Mustafa Hafid, placed their work in the busy public square of Jemaa el-Fna in order to reach a broader public that did not necessarily feel welcome in the official spaces of the fine arts. Unconfined to an enclosed art space and interested in how exposure to the elements might affect the material and intellectual aspects of the work, the artists stayed with the abstract artworks for the duration of the 10-day exhibition to try to engage passersby in conversation about the modernist work. The artists were all faculty at the Casablanca École des Beaux-Arts, directed by Farid Belkahia, where they worked to reimagine an anti-colonial pedagogy for the art school, focusing on the culture and visual heritage of independent Morocco. The terminology for this group, the Casablanca School, thus refers both to the art school where they taught and to their formation as a group of practicing artists. While visually their work varies significantly, in their individual practices, each artist similarly sought to ground modernist abstraction within Morocco through specific signs, artisanal materials, or through research into the applied abstractions of Islamic art. These abstractions, created in a discursive relation to the political project of modernism within post-colonial nationalism, were exhibited in présence plastique with the intention of reaching a larger national public for this politically charged work. In the statement they released on the exhibition, they wrote that they wanted to, quote, awaken the interest of the man of the street, his curiosity, his critical spirit, stimulate it, done so that he integrates new plastic expressions within his rhythm of life, within his daily space, end quote. Similar to the ways in which they sought to decolonize arts pedagogy, they also, recalling Frantz Fanon's conception of the role of the intellectual, saw themselves as playing a critical role in shaping the larger national culture. This talk will argue that the Casablanca School artists played a key role in defining modernism in the context of post-colonial Morocco. However, I will also argue that this experience of modernism cannot be understood apart from its relationship with transnational forms of solidarity. I will therefore look at the artist's collaboration with the journal Souffle as a critical instrument in articulating the national with the transnational. Casablanca School art historian Tonia Morini, looking back on the post-colonial period, writes about Morocco, quote, more than a style, modernity thus understood was a spirit and an attitude. Far from being established like an academy of styles, modern art became the space of questioning and unveiling, end quote. Art here does not exist for its own sake. To the contrary, this discursive construction of artistic modernism, that is, modernism as defined by the conscious claiming of it, locates modernism at the intersection of art, culture, politics, and activism. By the late 1960s, the fundamental question was about the role that art and artists had in shaping the broader culture of post-colonial Morocco. Art was not just confined to aesthetic debates. Art was part of a public conversation about decolonization and meant to incite a broader cultural change. The Casablanca School is the focus of my book, Moroccan Modernism, which is forthcoming at Ohio University Press in the New African Histories series. My research into this generation of artists in Morocco is part of a growing field of studies of post-colonial modernism. The term modernity implies the social changes connected to becoming modern, and the term modernism is used to discuss the artistic practices associated with modernity. There have been significant critiques of the notion of modernity from post-colonial theory, which has shown that the concept is both Eurocentric and critically linked to colonization. Within the African and Third World context, Salah Hassan has argued that modernist movements are structured around a sense of resistance because modernity arises out of the decolonization struggle, and that these movements are therefore necessarily linked to the project of nation building. Similarly, Chika Kakeagulu has argued that post-colonial modernism as an international phenomenon of the mid-20th century is characterized by the entanglement of art and nationalist ideology. This field of research offers new narratives of modernism from the perspective of formerly colonized countries. Studies of post-colonial modernism pay tribute to the richness of multiple artistic traditions, while also laying bare the systemic exclusions of modernity, given the ways that the logic of modernity is the logic of coloniality. This new research forces us to reimagine the prevailing hegemonic and Eurocentric histories of artistic modernism. My primary argument in the book, which will also be elaborated in this talk, is that the pedagogy, structural engagements, and transnational solidarities of this generation of Moroccan artists, and in particular the artists of the Casablanca School, form an intrinsic part of their broader artistic projects and are grounded in the same ideology and stakes. The actual art objects only make up one part of multifaceted, consistent, and wide-ranging artistic projects and must be analyzed in relation to these other activities. I additionally argue for a reading of Moroccan modernism that is deeply rooted in a contemporaneous national context, yet that arises from a cosmopolitan foundation in dialogue with transnational anti-colonial intellectual movements. Rather than explaining away these transnational connections, I argue that they are at the crux of modernism, and particularly the Moroccan experience of modernism itself. At the École des Beaux-Arts, the faculty, under the direction of Farid Belkahia from 1962 to 1974, sought to make art production and art practice relevant to the context of post-colonial Morocco. Turning away from the pedagogical models offered by European art schools, the faculty at the École des Beaux-Arts reimagined a modernist arts education to root art practice in the longer history of Moroccan visual culture, as opposed to European antecedents. Faculty insisted on rigorously researched projects into abstraction. In the classroom, they brought in Amazigh rugs and local silver metalwork to use as models, and led students on tours of historic sites throughout the country to build knowledge about applied forms of abstraction, putting mosque design in dialogue with the Bauhaus. The graphic design workshop included traditional Arabic calligraphy as well as research into commercial signage in the urban landscape of Casablanca. Under the protectorate, degrees from the school were awarded from France after reviews of dossiers that were sent to the former colonial center. Belkahia, when he took over in 1962, ended this practice, which meant practically that they stopped handing out diplomas because there was not an expedient way to accredit these degrees through the municipality of Casablanca. This pedagogy, in other words, actively sought to locate abstraction within the national heritage of Morocco, celebrating local visual practices as a form of post-colonial nationalism and rejecting Eurocentric educational practices. The artists' own practices were deeply linked to their pedagogy, as the artists similarly sought to root their abstractions in the longer lineage of Moroccan visual culture. Belkahia, throughout his career, explored the possible use of local artisanal techniques as an alternative to the structures of modernist painting. From the mid-1970s on, he began working with leather that was hand-stretched onto wooden supports, colored with natural and locally used dyes, and often featuring Tamazight, the alphabet of indigenous Amazigh people. Prior to this, and while director of the Casablanca School, he worked primarily with copper. The works consistently feature visual motifs culled from local visual culture, as well as organic lines that suggest corporeality and regeneration. They also highlight the physicality of the object itself, both the material and the intervention of the artist. Belkahia, throughout his life, rooted this artistic work in questions of post-coloniality and third worldism, by which I mean the broad movement of the third world as a non-aligned political movement. Melehi's iconic style centered on the repetition of a wave within hard-edged abstractions, done usually in cellulose and acrylic paint. Within these paintings, the hand of the artist is invisible, as the industrial paint allows for crisp application with precise edges. Instead of an individual artist's perspective, the abstractions seem to be rooted in vibrating colors that are moving of their own will, zooming, refracting, pushing through. These waves can be understood within traditions of modernism like color field and hard-edged abstraction that emphasize the flat surface of the painting through deliberately impersonal paint application. The wave itself and the refraction of the light further connect to contemporaneous scientific exploration in electromagnetic radiation and its visible spectrum, light waves. For Melehi, the wave was also fundamentally rooted in his Moroccan identity. Upon his return to Morocco in 1964, after spending 10 years abroad, he undertook research into rural and urban forms of popular art within the country and linked the modernist preoccupation of flat optic abstraction that could be integrated into or put in dialogue with angular architecture with traditional art in Morocco, as in the practice of placing tiles called zillij. He believed that his own use of abstraction was fundamentally part of a conception of geometric abstraction within an Islamic ontology, and further elaborated through the emphasis on central signs, which can be linked to signs in Amazigh visual culture. In the wave itself, there is a further connection to his hometown of Asila, which is a small town on the coast. In the late 1960s and 1970s, Mohammed Shabaz's work also revolved around graphic abstraction. These are carefully designated lines, shapes, and colors, often done with the precision of acrylics. There's movement and life to these forms that push through and against a sense of rigidity, and yet Shabaz described this turn in his work following early black and white gestural experimentation by what he called its rigorous control. Valuing a conceptual project based in both the practical and theoretical aspects of creation, Shabaz began using these bright colors and disciplined forms to show that, in his words, quote, "There's not only a tragic and oppressive human condition, but also a vitality that allows man to defend himself and to research possible paths to liberation," end quote. In other words, for Shabaz, there was a revolutionary potential to the use of color in abstract work that was specifically located both in relationship to Moroccan visual culture and to its lived political landscape. While the artists sought to root their pedagogy and practice in relation to the aesthetic and political context of post-colonial Morocco, they expanded their scope through their collaboration with the cultural and literary journal Souffle. Mohamed Malehi and Tony Moraini joined the faculty in 1964, and Shabaz was hired in 1966 to teach graphic arts and calligraphy. That same year, as the movement of artistic modernism coalesced in Casablanca, Souffle was founded in 1966 as a French-language journal in Rabat by Abdelatif Labi, in concert with like-minded poets and artists, including from the beginning those from the Casablanca school. Souffle, which means breaths or perhaps inspiration, became bilingual with Arabic in 1971, then called Anfas, and was ultimately forcibly shut down by the Moroccan government. Responding to the needs of society, Souffle was meant to act as a site for intellectuals to rally in revolution against both post-colonial imperialist and lasting colonial cultural domination. While the journal from the beginning did not, quote, recognize any border, thus inviting others to participate in what they called a brotherly way, Souffle began as a local venture focused on the role of art and culture in newly independent Morocco. The opening of the manifesto issue specifically proclaims that the founders were, through this journal, taking a stand, quote, at a moment when issues pertaining to our national culture have reached a degree of extreme tension, end quote. The preliminary question was thereby one of national culture, with a small scope of French language intellectuals in the political and economic capitals of Morocco, Rabat and Casablanca. From this starting point, though, the journal quickly expanded to highlight theorists, artists, activists, and events from across the Third World. Souffle did not just reflect the larger trend towards transnational anti-colonial solidarity, it played an active role in creating a constellation of liberation movements that was not drawn along lines decided by geography, region, race, or culture, but by the liberatory activism of its participants. While creating a map of solidarity, the journal maintained Morocco as an integral node in this network. By virtue of creating this anti-colonial network with Morocco at its heart, Souffle makes an argument not just for transnational solidarity, but for seeing the actions within Morocco as part of this transnational solidarity. Impacting all forms of Moroccan modernism, including the visual, through the collaboration with the Casablanca school artists, Souffle bridged the space between the national and transnational. The extreme tension around national culture that Labi pointed to in the beginning was twofold. Morocco had become independent from France in the south and Spain in the north in 1956. Founded 10 years after independence, Soufla, on the one hand, emerges more broadly in the context of post-colonial Morocco. If the preceding generation had focused on the political fight against the colonial system, the intellectuals associated with Soufla focused more broadly on the subjectivity and cultural ramifications of colonization. As Labi described in 2015, looking back on this era, and I'll quote him at some length, quote, "The generation that fought for independence never asked itself the question of whether colonization was a loss of autonomy and national dignity, or if it was a loss of something else. What happens in a colonial situation? Is it simply political oppression, economic, or is it something else? It was my generation that concretely asked itself about these problems. What happened culturally? What was the colonial enterprise in the framework of culture? What was the impact of colonial politics on the being, on the psychology of Moroccans, on their identity, on the relationship they have with their past, present, and future?" End quote. If the general context in which Soufla emerged was one of post-colonial rebuilding, the more specific context was the dawn of heavy political repression called the Years of Lead. Soufla was founded the year after the disappearance and assassination of opposition leader Mehdi Ben Barka, as well as the violently repressed March 23, 1965 student protests in Casablanca. Following these protests, King Hassan II, who had ascended to the crown in 1961, instituted a state of emergency, and Parliament was thus disbanded in practice until 1975. Within the Years of Lead, Hassan II's regime was marked by heavy repression, disappearances, and censorship. In this context, within the prologue to the first issue, Labi outlines his goals. This language is closely aligned with the vision of the Casablanca School artists. And while Labi writes about literature and poetry, his words clarify the stakes of the larger cultural interventions of this era. He explains that literature had become unable to touch readers due to the lack of connection to social and political conditions. He calls instead for, quote, "a literature that bears the burden of our current realities, of wholly new problematics, in the face of which disarray and savage revolt are gripping us," end quote. While the focus is on Moroccan culture, it is nonetheless contextualized by the larger Third World. In his words, quote, "Something is about to happen in Africa and in the rest of the Third World, and the day when the true spokespersons of these collectivities really make their voices heard, it will be a dynamite explosion in the corrupt secret societies of the old humanism," end quote. Thus, the journal was meant to be what he termed the vehicle of a new poetic and literary generation. Not just its voice, the word choice, the vehicle, betrays the active way in which Labi saw Soufla as creating and mobilizing a generation of intellectuals. He ends stirringly with a call for the importance of poetry and perhaps by extension, artistic output in the context of this upheaval. Quote, "Poetry is all that is left to man to reclaim his dignity, to avoid sinking into the multitude, so that his outcry forever carries the imprint and attestation of his inspiration," end quote. Frantz Fanon argued in Wretched of the Earth, published 5 years before the founding of Soufla, that, quote, "national consciousness is alone capable of giving us an international dimension," end quote. Fanon takes seriously the importance of solidarity between liberation movements, yet is careful to stipulate that this solidarity is possible primarily from the position of the nation. It is thus the national character that by its existence can influence and penetrate other cultures, with combat literature providing shape for national consciousness and a platform through which to call upon the masses to join in the struggle for the nation. A similar attitude can be seen in Soufla, especially at first, and this extended to the visual arts. Visual arts and artists were part of Soufla from the first issue. Labi was preparing the first issue with poets Mustafa Nisaburi and Mohammed Khaireddin when they saw an exhibition in Rabat of 3 visual artists, Farid Belkahia, Mohammed Shaba, and Mohammed Malahi. Seen here is the poster for that exhibition. These artists were at the center of the debates on the role of visual art in post-colonial Morocco. And it was with this same exhibition in 1966 at the National Theatre in Rabat that the artists began identifying as a school or group, that is, the Casablanca School. Labi believed the artists were grappling with the same questions about modernity, post-coloniality, and national culture, and so they were actively involved in the creation of the issues. Malehi was artistic director of Souffle until 1968, at which point he was replaced by Shabat. Additionally, Malehi had designed the poster for the Rabat exhibition and went on to design the first cover of Souffle, which was then used for the first 14 issues. The visual artists, like other contributors to Souffle, were deeply invested in questions of modernity and Moroccan artistic heritage, and the way in which that heritage could be employed to assert a local modernity. Although the early issues still sketch out the contours of third worldism, they primarily emphasize national culture as an integral part of modernism more than transnational solidarity. For example, there was a special issue in 1967 dedicated to the visual arts, which featured a questionnaire on art and national culture. 8 artists responded to questions on how each situated himself with regard to Moroccan artistic traditions and his beliefs about the role of art in elaborating a national culture. The article at the opening of the issue by Labi places this explicitly in the debates around national culture after colonialism. Aimed at an entire generation of artists, the introduction can be read as a call to arms. Labi begins by disparaging colonialism and the aftermath of European influence, as well as the failures he sees of the previous generation. He then identifies that, quote, an awakening, restrained certainly, but all awakenings begin like this, is spreading in Morocco, a call to the current generation to throw themselves into a decisive undertaking of clearing out and of reconsideration. Indeed, the time has come for us to shake off the torpor of the colonial trauma and come face to face with our history, end quote. What Labi describes for visual artists is similar to what he had written about poets and writers. Both the sense of change that was coming and the responsibility held by the generation to actively confront the history of colonization, suggesting the shared stakes of the project of post-colonial modernism. The journal played a significant role for the visual arts, both intellectually, in shaping the terms of the debates the artists were having, and in disseminating their work. In the first issue, Belkahia, Shabat, and Malehi all contributed illustrations attributed to them as a group rather than individually. While connected to the artist's larger bodies of work, rather than photographs of existing works, the pieces, which you can see here, seem like sketches. Instead of showcasing their finished work, here the images suggest that Souffle is instead meant to be a working space, a place to try out new ideas and demystify art. Later issues reproduced distinct finished works. Each issue would focus on images of one specific artist's work, putting visual art into dialogue with the written essays, while also bringing more visibility to the artists. They showcased primarily Moroccan artists, although in one of many motions towards pan-Maghrebi solidarity, Mohamed Khadda, the Algerian modernist, was featured in 1967. From the 9th issue on, the focus of Souffle shifted from the more narrow focus of Moroccan national culture to the broader politics of third worldism and anti-colonial activism. Labi explained this change in both national and transnational terms, writing that it seemed like a journal that was only literary could become a kind of luxury, given the deficiencies and limitations of the national press. He more broadly saw an emerging potentiality to contribute to both the new national culture and creatively find paths for societal transformations through research on concrete social realities. The goal was thus to make the journal into, in his words, quote, an adequate instrument of work, communication, and combat, end quote. The journal became resolutely political, openly engaged with the radical political group Ila La Mem, founded by Labi and leftist militant Abraham Serfati, who had joined the editorial board of Souffle in 1968. New rubrics were put into the journal based on workers' rights and struggle. The Casablanca artists contributed posters to the 1969 special issue called For the Palestinian Revolution, but the visual identity of the journal shifted along with the broader changes to the journal's focus. The special issue on Palestine, which included 7 posters by visual artists, marked the final collaboration between the Casablanca artists and Souffle, with the exception of Sheba and 2 of his students who took on increasingly prominent roles at the journal. The resolute focus on political activism and Marxist-Leninism led to more cartoons and posters rather than reprints of abstract modernist artworks. Sheba became artistic director, taking over from Malehi, and under his influence and with the changing focus of the journal, these posters featured varied political struggles and activists, including Palestinian Fedayeen, Black Panthers, and Golan militants, and Patrice Lumumba. Some of these posters were developed locally, especially by Mohammed Sheba, Ali Nouri, and Abdullah Hariri, and others were reprints from OSPAL, which is the Organization of Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and Tricontinental Magazine. The visual material in the journal both reflected the increased focus on transnational solidarity and physically mapped it through this collaboration with OSPAL. While the visual character of the journal changed, Souffle continued to use art and design as an integral means of expression of solidarity. This did not extend to Anfas, the parallel Arabic language journal. Founded in 1971, Anfas marked the increasing shift towards identification with the larger struggles across the Arab world, as well as a turn away from French as a colonial language. Anfas almost entirely excluded visuals, seeming to foster not just a different language, but a different identity for the publication, much as the cover can be read as an echo of the early issues of Souffle. Like early covers of Souffle, Anfas maintained the same cover design repeated in multiple colors. The original Souffle cover design, featuring Malehi's central irregular spot in varied colorways, was no longer used after issue 1314 in 1969, after which new covers were designed featuring photographs or prints based on contemporary events. The Anfas covers with the title printed over a brightly colored circle recall those early Souffle covers, although the clean edges of the circle are sleeker, and the inclusion of 6 or more headlines at the bottom of each cover underline the emphasis on activism more than culture. The first issue of Anfas included a photograph of a protest in which one man is marching, holding Sheba's Palestine poster from the 1969 special issue cover of Souffle, and the second issue includes a reprint of Abdullah Hariri's poster from the same issue. Aside from those and some scattered designs meant to mark the end of specific sections, Anfas does not include other images or artworks, marking a decisive shift away from the cultural politics of Souffle. Before being shut down by the Moroccan government in 1972, with its major participants, including Mohammed Sheba, arrested and jailed, Souffle mapped a transnational and tricontinental network of anti-colonial protest and solidarity. In one issue, a text by Haitian writer René Despestre on tricontinental decolonization from the 1969 Pan-African Cultural Festival in Algiers is presented in a dossier with texts by delegations from Guinea and the Portuguese colonies, including Frelimo, a manifesto on the role of African culture in the struggle for liberation and African unity, and the 10-point program of the Black Panthers. In another issue, a text by anti-colonial activist Amilcar Cabral is printed along with documents on ongoing liberation struggles across Africa, titled Africa, One and the Same Combat. along with a report on workers' struggles in the mines of Haribka in Morocco, a report on the struggles of the Bolivian people following the coup d'etat that led to Hugo Banzer's presidency, was printed in another issue because the editors of the journal saw it as their duty to inform readers about, quote, the major national and popular liberation struggles in the world, end quote. The map that is created is one of anti-colonial solidarity, not hemmed in by geography, but created to forge solidarities across movements. Labi sought to invigorate readers to exercise their critical capacities against all violence committed against the third world, beyond alliances of race or culture, in ways that were mirrored by Shabaz's artistic direction. The map that was created by Soufna remained grounded in the nation and was fundamentally linked to what the editors saw as the responsibility of Moroccans. Struggle was local and transnational, and more than that, transnational struggle had implications locally, and vice versa. If the focus of Soufna opened out to encourage a politics of solidarity, the importance of the journal was in bridging the transnational and the national. Beyond creating this network, it contextualized the work that these Rabat and Casablanca-based writers and artists were doing locally in order to make Morocco into a critical node within this network. Within the content of the journal, as well as the positions taken by the editorial board, there was thus simultaneously an opening to liberatory struggles across the Third World and an explicit connection to militant national politics, both of which were considered dangerous in the context of Hassan II's regime. The rupture within Soufna between cultural politics and direct political activism plotted against the growing threats of Hassan II's years of led many of the visual artists to stop collaborating with the journal after 1969. This became a definitive break when Belkahia stopped allowing the group to meet at the School of Fine Arts. This also led to the end of the Casablanca School as a united movement, although the pedagogical institution continued on and remains open to this day. It was in the context of these rising tensions about the relationship between art and politics that Shabab, Malehi, and Marraine all left the school at the end of 1969, followed by Atala in 1970. Belkahia did not leave the school until 1974, but once Malehi, Marraine, and Shabab had all left, the movement was effectively ended. Shabab was imprisoned along with Ali Nouri, his former student, for 18 months from 1972 to 1973. The Casablanca School as a movement ended over a break about political versus cultural action, as many poets and writers advocated direct political action, while many of the visual artists became increasingly focused on less directly political cultural action. Understood within the context offered here of specific intellectual, artistic, and pedagogical projects rooted in post-colonial national culture, this can be understood not as a backing away necessarily, but a difference in tactics. In 1974, for example, many of the artists who had been linked to the Casablanca School released a statement at the first Arab Biennial restating the ways in which Arab art was meant to act as a catalyst or even a weapon for social and political change. The struggle for Arab existence needed to be met by an awareness of the importance of the plastic arts in expressing the growing political awareness as well as the lived realities of the masses. In their words, quote, "Arab man does not live by bread alone, and a motivating canvas is not so different from a bullet, the difference between the plastic artist and the soldier being one of appearances," end quote. For these visual artists, in the context of the years of lead, the bullet remained more oblique as their focus was increasingly on cultural politics. The history of the Casablanca School adds to the complexity of art historical theorizations of modernism, by showing that the question of artistic modernism is continually a renegotiation of the local in an international and transnational context. Many narratives of post-colonial modernism seem to follow similar logics, highlighting the ways in which artists localized transnational aesthetics like abstraction to fight against the lasting impact of imperialism on culture, articulated through the political project of modernity. However, the notion and stakes of modernity are always profoundly rooted in a local context and need to be understood as emerging through and against local art and political histories. At the same time, it would be a mistake to limit these movements to the claustrophobia of discretely nation-based narratives. To the contrary, the example of Moroccan modernism shows that the richness of modernism can be found in the simultaneous ways that the movement was both locally embedded and in active dialogue and solidarity with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holiday, for this really engaging talk. I know at least some of the attendees who happen to be my students in the course I'm teaching this semester on modern contemporary art from the Middle East will have many questions, and I probably really enjoyed this talk as well. I think your talk is really important. It raises lots of the issues that are being debated in the field today. And I really found it very inspiring how you know, through your research and methodology, you're reading modern Moroccan art practices in the mid-20th century in connection to this notion of transnational solidarities, anti-colonial networks, and really a lot of these artists' deeply pedagogical commitment. And I think this particular methodology, this particular approach, and the questions that you raise are really important today, particularly when we are trying to consider how to write decolonial histories of modern Arab art. And so I just overall, that was, you know, what I really found very inspiring about your talk. I also really just have a few comments before I open up the floor for questions. I also really appreciated how you didn't just focus on the medium of painting by these artists, but also really, again, as a part of their broader commitment politically, but also in relationship to pedagogy in the public, you really also considered the graphic design work and art direction work that they engaged in, whether, you know, for exhibition programs, illustrations, and journal covers, is sort of everyday ephemera that we often overlook when we're writing such histories. And in fact, that these spaces are very important spaces for artists and their practice, as you so you know, wonderfully explained in your talk, that these really become these important working spaces. And so, as you know, in thinking about all these ideas, I was wondering, when it comes to the question of the artist's commitment to the general public, or in the beginning, how you said that their commitment to sort of showing even painting to the men of the streets, I was wondering how much, you know, they turn to other forms of public engagement beyond, for instance, journals or paintings, but whether some of these artists were also interested in things like sculpture as part of, you know, art in the public space or public art, and whether they even turned to poster design and poster production, as many of their contemporaries did in the rest of the Arab world, particularly in response to, you know, the Palestinian, the global solidarity movement with Palestine and other deeply political concerns at this time.
Well, so through SUFLA, they did release a number of posters, and Abdelatif Labi has been very generous in sharing images with me, and it has really opened up how significant the visual program was, extending to posters that would presumably be in public space, but also things like design for book covers, for books that were being published and things like that. The artists were very invested in different forms of collaboration across disciplines. And so they were in conversation and collaboration, for instance, with theater groups, although they were not actively taking part in that. For sculpture, it's really only recently that there are those kinds of sculptures in public spaces in Morocco,
Right.
including by them, incidentally.
Right. So unlike what you tend to see in Iraq, for instance, or like in Baghdad or Cairo, it's not. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, because it's also not the government that is funding it. So in the case of Iraq, where that is really pushed forward by the government, this is at odds in some sense with the government, or with the government maybe not noticing, ideally. The Casablanca School, for instance, the school itself is a municipal school. So there is a national art school in Tetuan, but the Casablanca Art School is actually a municipal school that up to now is actually under the aegis of Casablanca as a municipality and not the Ministry of Culture. And so that distance from the nation, I think, also explains perhaps why there aren't these major public works from this era.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about the regional particularities, despite this sort of transnational commitment and overlaps. I see that we actually have a few questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to drop in questions in the chat or to use the Q&A function. So the first question is from one of our viewers, Monique Herman. She's saying, I'm curious as to the readership or reach of soufflés. Obviously, it was known to the government, but what about its circulation in general? Have you been able to document this in your research?
So Kenza Safriwi is a Moroccan scholar who has worked on souffle as a literary journal. And so she has done that work of looking specifically at the circulation, tracing as much as possible where it went to. It certainly was known by the government, also because this was being published in Rabat, and Rabat is very small. And so, for instance, the children of all of these opposition leaders were also in school with the children of the people within the regime. And so they would be hanging out and spending time together. Like, this isn't a distant relationship to centralized power, but to the contrary, something that is pretty intimate. So the journal circulated, different issues had different numbers of how many were printed based on financing. For instance, the visual arts issue was financed out of pocket by the artists themselves. So they all contributed money to cover the printing costs. But because of financial issues that would change based on the issue, they did have options to subscribe internationally. And so the journal was certainly moving around with some significant readership abroad.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I feel like it also shares a lot of similarities with other journals that were in circulation at this time. The same limitations, if you will, the ideals of how they would circulate and the reality of how such journals circulate. I
just want to add, Hala, about the question of the government knowledge of souffle, that at the trial of the souffle members, the entirety of the run of souffle was entered as evidence. And that was basically the entire body of evidence, was simply the issues of souffle itself and NFAS.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's fascinating. Goddard has a question. She says, that was amazing. Could you say more about the use of language, especially French, as a colonial language that also has potential for transnational solidarities? And I'd love to hear more about the role of photography.
So in terms of language, language is a challenging subject within Morocco. So at this time, I think about 50% of the Moroccan population was illiterate. So Moroccan Darija, which is the Arabic that is spoken in Morocco, is pretty significantly different from written Fusha. And so only 50% of the population would have access to written Arabic. And so when thinking about the circulation of languages, the distance between the Moroccan Darija and modern standard Arabic is one significant question within that. Many of the artists did not feel comfortable in Fusha. So Shaba was writing an arts criticism column in Arabic and had specific things that he did in Arabic. For instance, there was this kind of performative reading of a statement in Fusha at a meeting of international artists about or national artists rather, about the challenges faced by Morocco. But within the classroom, it was primarily a mixture of French and Darija. I recently spoke with one of the students, Malika Agasne, who said that really, with the exception of Shaba, nobody would have felt comfortable expressing themselves fully in modern standard Arabic. So once it shifts to Anfas, there is a move by poets and writers that are rejecting French. That French as a language, on the one hand, I think it's true what you are saying, which is that French as a language also offers potentiality for different forms of solidarity across the French-speaking world. With the move towards Arabic, it was also a move towards Pan-Arabism and really focusing on connections with the Arab world as opposed to that same sort of tricontinental understanding. In terms of photography, Malahi was the person that took almost all of the photographs. So most of the photographs that exist were really taken by Malahi. So all of the photographic documentation was by Malahi, who, once he left Sufla and once he left the Casablanca school, opened up his own cultural journal called Integral, and he also opened his own publishing house called Shuf. So he was taking photographs, but more as a form of documentation. He was teaching photography, but I haven't specifically worked on photography as an art form so much as on photography as documentation of the events.
Yeah, that makes sense. We still have another question, and this is from one of my students. Ashley Botkin is asking, what inspired you to work on this topic? How do you think this topic translates or relates to modern conceptions of the Middle East today?
Well, so I started on this topic. I had started graduate school and didn't really know what I was going to focus on, and started studying Arabic in Morocco, and was invited to work on the 2009 edition of the Marrakesh Biennial, which was the first time that it was called a biennial as opposed to an arts festival. And I was writing the catalog with the curator, who was telling me, oh, you have to say about this artist that he's unlike the previous generation, that he is engaged in politics in this way. And I said, well, what happened with the previous generation? And went to look, and there really was no information about it at that time. And so I stuck with it, became really invested in this history. In terms of what it says about the Middle East today, I think that's a hard question. I guess I have paused in part because here I am in Qatar. And so I feel like my perspective on the region is also so located from inside of the region and from inside of the Gulf. I think that one of the significant shifts that has happened in art history is that when I started this project in 2009, there wasn't really a field of Arab art history. There wasn't an existing field of people who were working in modern Arab art. And so when I started, Morocco was really only legible to colleagues through the framework of Africa. And even now, my book is coming out in the New African Histories series. And I think that one of the significant shifts that has happened, which I think is also really positive, is understanding the Middle East or the Arab world more expansively. So as opposed to only focusing on a relatively small number of countries, that this understanding of the region has expanded both to Morocco in the West and to the Gulf in the East, because the Gulf has also been largely excluded from many of these conversations. So I think that is what I would say that it adds to conversations about the Middle East, thinking about this region more fully and expansively and understanding the complexity of what we even mean by that terminology.
We have time for one more question if anyone has one. I mean, related to what you were just saying, and maybe this is how we can wrap this up, working in Doha, actually teaching your course in Mathaf at the Museum of Modern Art in Doha, how much of your work in Doha has informed your actual research? I mean, how much art is collected, or how much of an interest exists in Qatar, in Doha, in relationship to art from Morocco and from the broader Maghreb? And, have you seen a shift that's been taking place recently? Have you been involved in any way in trying to kind of, solidify some of these networks or connections, in, bringing Morocco out of the margin?
Well, so what's actually interesting about that is that really the most significant collection of Moroccan art is no longer in Morocco, but is in Doha. And the Mathaf collection, they have acquired so widely from all of the major Moroccan artists that really so many of the critical works and just an encyclopedic amount of works for all of these artists, that's really in Mathaf. And as I understand it, coming in Abu Dhabi as well. And so that shift has happened. In part, the former director of Mathaf was Moroccan and had a relationship with these artists and oversaw some of these purchases. I think that also was towards the end of many of these artists' lives. And so their relationship with Mathaf also strengthened at a time when estates were trying to understand what would happen to a lot of this work. And so I think that one of the wonderful things about being in Doha is actually that I'm with this work every week, that I have such an intimate relationship to the work, which I never had in Morocco. Because in Morocco itself, I mean, it's a little different now with the museum that has now opened in Rabat, but previously it was very hard to see the work itself because the work would be held by private collectors or whatever the case may be. But now it is actually accessible to me. And so I'm able to work very closely with specific artworks, which is a gift.
Yeah, and it's a rare gift.
So,
so, I mean, with that, I just want to thank you again so much, Dr. Powers, for this really inspiring lecture and for this wonderful conversation. It was a pleasure. And thank you, everyone else, our virtual audience, for joining us. And I think this will be recorded and placed online at some point. So goodbye, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Hala, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.